First, I'd like to make my own personal welcome to David and show our appreciation for his joining us here. Just tell you very briefly in just a few moments about how we came to meet, and I'll leave most of the evening to David because he's really obviously the attraction. No, people like this don't come to hear me. It's a character building, I suppose. But the story is that I got a letter from David, email actually some time ago, telling me that he was a person searching for a Jewish way to do some of the things that he was doing in Buddhism. And we entered a long correspondence, and it turned out that he's a very articulate and thought-out person, and a person I learned to admire greatly. This is a person who had no Jewish background, and in the last couple of years taught himself Hebrew, put himself through a bar mitzvah, in which he read the Torah and Haftarah. I mean, that's quite a remarkable thing. So the first thing we did was offer him a job here, but we entered a long correspondence, and eventually we published a book together, which is called Letters to a Buddhist Jew. It's an excellent book. You need at least 2 copies, and if you buy 3, you'll understand it, especially deeply. We've had the opportunity of learning together and teaching together, and what I propose to do this evening is let David tell you a story. I'm obliged to respond, I guess, and I'll say something for a few minutes, but I think the interesting part will be your questions and our answers, especially David's answers. So without further ado, let me ask him to tell you something about his path. Do you want to stick it in there?
No, I think so. Good evening. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'll try to be as succinct and as entertaining and as audible as I can. If you can't hear me, just throw something, and I'll do my best to both duck and be more audible. I want to extend my great thanks to Rabbi Tatz for making this whole experience possible, and to JLE for being extremely hospitable for having me here. So in telling my story, I just want to make a couple of things clear before I do. I have to give you some background so that you can understand, even though my knowledge is microscopic, I need to tell you where I come from so that you can understand that compared to where I was, I'm a Torah scholar now, okay? And that this is not at all unusual in terms of where many, many American Jews come from and why it's important. The reason it's important that I give you the background is that if I do that, you'll understand better why the statistics about American Jews drawn to Eastern religions are so stunning. I'm sure many of you are familiar with many of the statistics that get thrown around, but some that really, to me, paint a very vivid picture. I'll give you a couple of statistics and an anecdote. The statistics are that according to, I've been reading some studies about the extent of assimilation among American Jewry, which I think is a fact that's extremely well known, and also, what's less well known, the extent to which American Jews are affiliating with other religious traditions. I thought I was being terribly original. Turns out I was part of a trend. So Stephen Prothero, who's a professor of religion at Boston University, has done studies on this and discovered that American Jews are 6 times more likely to affiliate with another religion than are Americans of any other religious background. The other really shocking statistic that still amazes me, though I've been familiar with it for some time now, is that of every 3 Buddhists born in the United States, 1 of them is born Jewish. Okay, it's a little hard to understand, so let me say it again. Of every 3 Buddhists born in the United States, 1 of them is born Jewish. And you'll know if you go to the bookshelves in the Buddhist section of any bookstore in the United States that has a religious section, you'll see books by Zenkei. So you get, when you become a priest in Buddhism, you get a fancy sort of Japanese first name. So there are guys like Zenkei Bernie Glassman, Zoketsu Norman Fisher. These names are not at all uncommon. Other Jewish authors who are Buddhist authors are Sharon Salzberg. The list goes on and on. So there is now a well-established generation of Buddhist teachers who, in fact, are Jewish. Okay, so that's kind of the overall picture. Now I should shock you a little bit less, but hopefully entertain you a little bit more. My personal background is that I am the youngest of 6 children born to 2 Jewish parents, and that until about 6 months ago, I was the only one married to a Jew. I have 4 older sisters and an older brother. The oldest sister is married to a Romanian. The second sister is married to a gentleman whose descendants came off the Mayflower, the first ship escaping from Ulat, as you like to say here. The third sister has been married 3 times. This time she's finally married to a Jewish guy. Third time is the charm, I guess. My fourth sister had 2 husbands. The first was a Mexican Catholic gentleman. Her current husband is a Armenian Christian who was born and raised in Lebanon. And my brother's wife is an Episcopal priest. So you can gather from this that my background was not only not Jewish, in some very subtle but distinct way, it was really anti-Jewish. We were proud of the sort of moral and ethical heritage of being Jewish, but we had very, very, very little in the way of Jewish education. We belonged to a Reform synagogue, a sort of high German Reform synagogue, which, Sunday school consisted of getting dressed up very uncomfortably and singing Hine ma tovu manayim for 3 hours, which you'd only learned phonetically, and you never learned what it meant. And you felt that what was communicated, at least this is what I recall, is that you were to be the guardian of the mausoleum of the Jewish tradition that had been extinguished in the Holocaust or reduced to hysterical superstition. What you were doing was guarding the crypt and keeping that flickering flame alive. That what you were doing was not experiencing a living tradition, but sort of guarding something that was basically on life support, if not altogether dead. That's the context in which this story begins. The story moves then into my first wife was not Jewish. We didn't have children. And then about 15 years ago, I met and fell in love with a very Jewish woman who already had 2 children by a previous marriage. And when it was clear to her that I was getting ready to pop the question, that's okay to say in Britain, pop the question. Good. So I've made some terrible mistakes with American English. They've been really embarrassing. When it was clear to her that I was getting ready to pop the question, she said, look, I'm a committed Jewish woman, raised an observant Jew. I'm keeping a kosher kitchen. I have 2 young daughters from a previous marriage who are being raised in that tradition. By the way, one of them is here tonight, and she's sure to stand up if I say anything that's stretching the truth. I won't point her out, though. And she said, if you're serious about this, then you have to get serious about Judaism. You can play the part, but it really won't work. You have to be committed to raising the girls in a kosher home, in a Jewish home, being Shomer Shabbat. That probably has an asterisk on it for many of you here, but in America it was shocking. And you have to be committed to that. I said, I'm in. I'm in. Is that okay to say? Okay. So this began, in earnest, my Jewish education. And that began with an adult confirmation at the Reform synagogue where she worked. Even though she was raised in the conservative movement and was very observant growing up for a variety of reasons which are too complicated to go into, she became a cantor, a chazanit, at a Reform synagogue. Reform Judaism really wasn't for her, but she was very idealistic about getting Reform Jews to be more observant. And she was very committed to her work. We had different guests over for Shabbat dinner every Friday night, many of whom not only had never been to a Shabbat dinner, they didn't know what it was. They didn't know exactly what it consisted of. So she really worked hard at her job. So I began to get Jewishly educated. Then in 1996, we moved back to Chicago from Denver. Chicago is where we're both from. And we joined the synagogue that her family, still all in the Chicago area, belonged to, a very traditional conservative synagogue. What does that mean? That basically means that although there's no mechitza, there's a very traditional service, all in Hebrew. A few hundred people there every Shabbat. Aside from the sermon and the prayer for our country, everything's in Hebrew. So I tell you this because after 2 years of studying at a Reform synagogue, I thought I knew everything there was to know. And then I walked into this conservative shul, and I felt like I had walked into a shtetl. I had no idea what was going on. Not only did I not have any idea what was going on, the attitude that I felt emanating from the rabbi and the members of the community was, well, shame on you for not knowing, go learn. I didn't feel as though there was an opportunity there to learn. And I had, for a variety of reasons, a kind of spiritual crisis. I'd committed to a Judaism that was making no sense to me. I found no quiet in it. And to me, quiet has always been an indisputable, unshakable part of any spiritual tradition. If you're going to make sense of the search for some greater truth, there has to be silence in which you can access it as an individual. I'm going to interrupt the story there to make us all do an exercise. Yes, all, however many of us there are here. If you're not sitting down, you have to get comfortable, because in order for this story to make any bit of sense, I'm going to need you all to meditate with me right now for 3 minutes. Don't panic. Don't run. I've checked with Rabbi Tatz. There's no avodah zarah in this exercise. We will not be bowing. We will not be chanting. This is the root of what Buddhist practice is. This is called objectless meditation. Here's what you do. Sit in your chair, if you're sitting, with your feet flat on the floor. Both feet flat on the floor. Put your hands in a comfortable position, preferably rest them on your knees. Direct your gaze roughly 45 degrees downward, and concentrate on your breathing, okay? I'm going to meditate with a microphone, which I don't usually do, because I'm going to have to talk you through some aspects of this, okay? So sit comfortably, and if you're not able to sit, then please stand comfortably. Don't cross your arms, just stand straight. And if you don't want to participate, have fun watching. What we're doing is we're just concentrating on the breath. Your tongue is resting lightly against the back of your upper front teeth, and you're breathing in and out through your nose. Now you're aware of sounds around you, you're aware of external stimuli, and you may be aware that you're thinking. Right now, for some of you, the quiet is deep and relaxing, and some of you are making grocery lists for tomorrow. That's okay. Let your mind do that. Don't try to stop it, but gently redirect it when you find yourself thinking about something back to the simple fact that you're breathing in and breathing out, and that you're concentrating on that. You should feel your chest gently expanding with each inhalation and exhaling with each exhalation. You're now part of an ocean of breathing people. We're all breathing, not necessarily in unison, but that is all that we're all engaged in right now. Now at the end of this meditation, which is fine for this to be now, this little mini experiment, just shut your eyes briefly. Return your thoughts to this room. Clear your mind of whatever was in it before and as you were. Open your eyes, look about you, rejoin us. Why did I have you do this? By the way, is it because you're British that you're so good at being quiet? This does not work with an American audience, and I did this with a group of kids at the Jewish Free School last week, and it was unbelievable. I mean, they were so good. They weren't as good as you, though. They really weren't. Why did I have you do this? I had you do this so that you could at least have some understanding of what is at the root of what is driving Western Jews toward Eastern traditions, Buddhism broadly, Zen Buddhism more specifically, though Zen Buddhism is certainly not the only Buddhism that they're being drawn to. What Western Jews are in search of, is something that lacks a story, that lacks a belief system, and that lacks, and that requires a focus on anything other than the self. I don't mean this to sound judgmental. I'm simply telling you what my experience of it is. American Jews in general are profoundly alienated from, many American Jews are, alienated from what it means to be Jewish. And they go in search of what's missing from their lives more than anything, which is a silent connection to all that is. Judaism makes that possible, but most American Jews don't know that. They don't know where to go to look for it. And there are very few places to go to look for it. There are few reputable places to go to look for it. So where do they go? They go where other American Jews are going, which by and large is to Buddhism. And now I have to explain to you how this couple of minutes that we spent, how much a part of my life it was and what it looked and felt like. And how I got there. I didn't explain that to you yet. So I endured this spiritual crisis where I was going to a very traditional shul and I didn't understand a thing that was going on. And I had a crisis. I was, although I was back in my hometown, I was in a very sort of posh suburban area, very different from the urban neighborhood that I'd grown up in. I was surrounded by my wife's family, which, as my daughter can tell you, is, you know, a blessing, but like many blessings, it's a mixed blessing. I was steeped in a kind of Jewish community and tradition that I had no access to. And I went to a therapist. I went to a Jewish woman of my acquaintance whose children went to the same Jewish day school that my children attended, and still one of the youngest still attends. And I explained to her this dilemma. And she listened to me and she said, okay, so what is your spiritual life missing? I said, I don't know. It's like, I go to shul and people are chatting. Some of them are praying, but most of them are chatting. During the silent Amida, they're chatting. And besides, I don't even understand what the heck the silent Amida is. But I know they shouldn't be chatting. I know. It appears to me, to the people who are upholding this tradition, that this tradition doesn't mean anything. It's not working for me. It doesn't mean anything. She said, well, maybe if the chatting bothers you, maybe you want to learn to meditate. I said, that's it. I want to learn to meditate. And she said, without skipping a beat, if you want to meditate, you have to go see the Buddhists. They're the best at teaching meditation. I said, okay, where do I go? She told me about a Zen center in a nearby suburb, and that began this deep 3-year excursion into Zen Buddhism, at the end of which I was lay ordained, which means I didn't become a priest, but became a formally accepted member of the Zen community, somebody who had embraced the Buddhist precepts as the way they were going to live their life. So you walk into a Zen center. What does it look like? Is it foreign? Is it alien? Not really at all. To many of you it would be, but to me, with no Jewish background, it really wasn't. Zen Buddhism started in the 5th century BC in India. The word Buddha means enlightened one. It was a time of great spiritual restiveness. People were searching for something. This guy apparently found it. He escaped a confined royal life, lived a very ascetic, lonely life for a long period of time, had some great revelation, and spent the rest of his life teaching it to people. It traveled from India to China, where a school called Chan Buddhism was founded, and then from China to Japan, where it was called Zen Buddhism. And that is the form that is the most stripped down and austere and simple of the many different forms of Buddhism. So you walk into a Zen center, and it's a plain, highly polished wooden floor. Square room. There are meditation cushions along 2 sides, a door on one side, and opposite the door, a little altar with a statue of the Buddha. Typically, there's an incense holder, and there's incense burning. And once you step into that room, you're part of a highly choreographed experience that is meant to conduct you silently toward understanding not just your own true nature, but the nature of everything that is. And you do that through objectless meditation. That's what we just did, 3 minutes of. I would go 3 to 5 times a week and do it for 35 minutes at a time. And I would go periodically to meditation retreats where I would do it on and off all day, alternating 35 minutes of seated meditation with roughly 8 minutes of walking meditation. This is really just meant to keep the blood flowing in your extremities, because sitting for 35 minutes, if you sat all day long, your legs could literally fall off. A break for 2 occasions. One is a silent ritual meal, prepared, eaten in silence, with a kind of prayer said. And the other break is what's called a Dharma talk, really a sermon by the Buddhist priest. At the end of a day of this, you feel like you have been molecularly changed. All that you do is you sit and you walk and you bow. What is the bowing? The bowing is before you sit on your meditation cushion, you bow to the people opposite you. Then you turn and every meditation cushion faces the wall, because that minimizes the distraction of facing other people. When you're done, you get up and you bow again to each other, and you bow to the statue of the Buddha at the head of the hall. There's the slight scent of incense constantly, which concentrates the mind. There's the sound of other people breathing, which you experienced. And there is you first engaged in mortal combat with your thoughts and your grocery lists. And pretty soon, you sink as if you're in a bathysphere beneath the level of your thoughts. You can sort of still see them going over your head, but you're not wrapped up in them. And then after a while, if you're lucky and disciplined and you've practiced, you stop thinking at all. Why is this important? Why is it important to stop thinking? It may not be important for everybody. It was important for me because I felt it was absolutely critical to strip away every story in order to get at some kind of truth. I'd had enough of stories. The stories, to me, were obstacles. And that turned out to be very congruent with Buddhist thinking. Buddhist thinking is pegged on 4 ideas. They're called the 4 Noble Truths. The first is that there's such a thing as suffering in the world. The second is that suffering is the result of clinging to and desiring things that don't really exist, that of themselves don't have any inherent reality. The third is that there's a way to end that suffering, and that enlightenment, all enlightenment really means is that you have discovered how to end your own suffering and commit yourself to ending that of other people. And the key to Buddhism is that suffering is caused when people tell themselves stories about how their lives are miserable because it's everybody else's fault. Because my spouse doesn't make enough money, my husband isn't good looking enough, my car isn't fancy enough, my parents didn't love me enough, I'm not good enough. All those things are stories that obstruct our understanding the true nature of reality. And if you spend enough time quietly not resisting these ideas, over time they sink into you and mean something to you. Okay, so along about now you're thinking, okay, so where is this wife of yours, this very observant wife? How's she feeling about all this? Let me read to you from the book. Why, thank you. Rabbi Tatz even marked the spot. I think that's his way of saying step on it. So my meditation teacher, the Zen priest with whom I was studying, was also a therapist, a Jungian therapist, who was devoted to the ideas and the disciplines of Carl Jung. And she was a Zen priest. Zen priest was her day job. And I was telling her about how resistant my wife was to my practicing at the Zen Center. And the priest said, why don't you bring your wife? Why don't you bring her here, and I'll be glad to meet with her and talk to her about it. So I wrote about this in the book. Here it is. At my meditation teacher's suggestion, my wife comes to the Zen Center to see for herself that it isn't a scary place that programs its members and turns out cult-addled clones. There, the priest, dressed conservatively in clothes that say, "Hi, I'm a Jungian therapist," greets my wife and shows her the meditation hall, the kitchen, the small library, the outdoor garden. She explains that people who come to the Zen Center are people from diverse religious backgrounds and that many of these people are still active in those religions. She even has a student who for more than 2 decades was a Carmelite nun. Why are there statues everywhere? My wife asks. Well, my meditation teacher says, the statues of the Buddha are there as reminders of the essence of what we call Buddha nature. They represent a certain kind of centered, aware, solid presence that we each have and can cultivate within ourselves. In my religion, my wife says acidly, we call that idol worship. It's strictly forbidden. Well, my teacher begins, oh, my wife interrupts. By the way, it's my husband's religion too, and it's the religion we're raising our children in, just so there's no confusion. I understand, the meditation teacher says. I begin staring intently at my shoes. So, why do you want to get my husband to practice this entirely different religion, my wife asks. What's in it for you? Is it kind of like saving souls? He came to me seeking instruction in meditation, the meditation teacher says evenly. I can see that it's something that's very important to him and that might benefit him. And when someone seeks instruction from me, I first try to discern whether they're serious about it. I can see that he is, and it's not in my nature or my job description, if you want to look at it that way, to refuse people instruction in what I've been trained to teach them. I hear there's a lot of bowing in Buddhism, my wife says. Do you bow? Yes, there is bowing, my teacher says. What do you bow to? Well, it depends on what part of the service we're in. Oh, my wife interrupts. So it's not just meditating, it's a regular religion with services and everything. Well, my teacher says it's true that Buddhism is a religion. And so what do you bow to again? My wife says. We may bow across the meditation hall to each other after a sitting, or we may bow to the Buddha statue at the head of the hall. If that's not idol worship, I don't know what is, my wife fairly spits. But that statue doesn't represent a deity, the teacher says. There's no worship per se in Buddhism. In bowing to the Buddha, my wife interrupts and says, you can call it whatever you want. We bow to the statue of the Buddha because we're recognizing and honoring Buddha nature. I think I've seen enough, my wife says, turning to me. Come on, let's go. My teacher regards my wife evenly for a second. My wife is breathing hard. Her nostrils are dilated. She's seething with revulsion and anger. The teacher tries once more. This is something he may pursue, though, the teacher says. It may be important for him that you... No, says my wife. I don't think so. The teacher says, so this is a conversation you'd rather have with yourself? That was our visit to the Zen Center. So my wife, Jewish down to the very depths of her soul, walked into this place and had an allergic reaction. At one point before entering the Zen Center, she had said to me, I'm sure Buddhism is a beautiful garden, but it's not our garden. And I tried to respond with something equally lyrical like, yes, but it may have seeds that we can translate. Maybe they'll pollinate, you know. It didn't really work, and she knew I was trying and that it was not succeeding. But I resolved nonetheless to go ahead because I did feel like it was important for me. Along about this time, she went to see an Orthodox rabbi that I studied with, and she said to this Orthodox rabbi, you have to help me stop him. He's engaged in idol worship. He's going further and further into it. He's spending more and more time there. He's drifting away from the family. You've got to help me stop him. And the Orthodox rabbi just sort of thought about it for a second and said, I don't think you want to stop him. And I'll tell you why. I think you don't want to stop him because he is a seeker by nature, and he's going to find what he wants in Judaism. But you have to give him opportunity to turn the ship around and come back. Don't interfere. Don't interfere in a spiritual search. Be patient and wait. In May of 2002, I decided to go through lay ordination, meaning to become a member of the Buddhist community. And at that point, my wife said to me, your practicing Buddhism is like a knife in my heart. So gone were the lyrical metaphors. Now we were into murder. And really unfaithfulness in a way. I mean, she made it clear that really what I was doing was being unfaithful to the marriage, which was very difficult for me, and I had to deeply reflect on that. I mean, one thing I did learn from Buddhism is that when you're wrong and you are staunchly defending your position, you're probably, you waste precious moments when you defend that position, even if on some level you know that what you're doing is profoundly harmful to a critical relationship or a critical part of your life. You have to stop kidding yourself as soon as you realize you're kidding yourself. And I began to think that what I was doing, if it was good for me at the expense of the wider community and relationships that I've dearly cherished, I couldn't be doing it. Buddhist sources and Jewish sources say, if you are engaged in a spiritual search that benefits you or that is based on you at the expense of the community, it is not a valid spiritual experience. Shortly after my lay ordination in May of 2002, I was seated in meditation in the Zen Center. Felt like I was a pro now, you know, knew how to do all the little choreography. And the culmination, by the way, of the ordination was sewing a sort of bib that a Buddhist initiate, that somebody who's formally been ordained wears. It's called a rakasu, and you have to sew it, and it's painstaking. You have to measure out and cut the pieces. They have to be exactly right. If they're not right, you have to start all over again. The stitches have to be tiny and evenly spaced. If they're not, you have to pull them out and start all over again. And you have to chant with each stitch, I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in Dharma, I take refuge in Sangha. Meaning, I take refuge in the Buddha as a historical figure that became enlightened. I take refuge in the knowledge that he produced, and I take refuge in the community. Not all that unfamiliar to each of us. At the end of this, the teacher writes on the back of the rakasu the formal name that you have been given as an initiate in the Zen community and presents it to you at this ceremony. Okay, so I put this thing on for the first time, and after, it's a very short time after my lay ordination, and I'm sitting in meditation, and something unbelievable happens, something unbelievable. I'm seated in meditation, and something lowers down sort of in my mind's eye and starts forgiving me and looking at me, forgiving me and looking at me. And my mind has played all the tricks it can play, and I'm hip to it now. I'm like, I see what you're doing now. This is not going to work. This is just another trick of the mind to try to get me to stop meditating. I sat with it. It didn't go away. I sat with it all through that meditation session and two more. And finally, this insistent presence that had come down over me each time I meditated it became clear to me, irrevocably clear, that I was finally in touch with my Jewish neshama and my Jewish essence, and I finally deeply understood that there was a divine presence for whom it mattered that there are Jews and that I was one of them. It sounds kind of hokey even as I say it, but I couldn't deny it, and it didn't go away, and I had to honor it. So about at that time, a rabbi of Rabbi Tatz and my mutual acquaintance said, I know this rabbi in England who's interested in learning more about why Jews are drawn to Buddhism. And I was struggling now with why I'd been drawn in the first place and what I was supposed to do now. Nothing made sense anymore. That's when my correspondence with Rabbi Tatz began. I didn't go to the Zen Center for a few months, and then I went back to say goodbye to my teacher. She hadn't seen me, and Buddhists are the kings and queens of equanimity. Nothing bothers them. Nothing bothers them. Everything is happening because it's happening. That's all. So she said, nice to see you. I said, it's good to see you too. I'm here to say goodbye. I really have to return to Jewish practice. She said, I understand. And we talked briefly, and as I began to leave the Zen Center, she said, before you go, would you mind moving that plant from there to the outside? It was a very interesting thing she did. It was a statement about how as long as I was within the boundaries of that community, I was still there to learn at her behest, to do what she asked me to do, to practice as a Buddhist. Didn't want to make a fight. I said, sure, I'll move the plant for you. I went out of the Zen Center and opened the door, and I looked down. And this was one of those summers where these terrible bugs in Chicago, throughout the Midwest of the United States called cicadas, were making their presence felt. They're like screeching beetles. It sounds like a horror movie. They come out of the ground, periodic intervals, screech all day and night, mate, shed their shells, and basically die, and the young go back under the ground until the next time they all come out. And what you're left with are bushes and trees all over the neighborhood that look like they have rigatoni shells hanging from them, which are really just the shells of the bugs that mated and died. And I went out of the door, and I saw on the door frame the husk of a beetle, perfectly preserved. Looked like a ghost of a bug, perfectly preserved on the door frame, hanging just by the little hooks on the end of its legs. And it struck me as an incredible metaphor for what I was leaving behind in the Zen Center. I felt as though I had shed my skin and walked out of that building, and that all that was left was the ghost of the experience behind me. Okay, so that's kind of the story. Here's the epilogue. The next thing I had to do was to try to get as Jewishly literate as I could. I'm getting older, as you can tell. My mind is not as nimble as it was. When I was young, my parents decided I really did need a deep cultural experience, so we went and lived in Mexico for a year. So that was an amazing experience. Obviously, there wasn't much that was Jewish about it. One of my sisters met and married a Mexican man on that trip, and so I have a niece named Paloma Nunez. She's a wonderful person. I got her to go on Birthright. It hasn't taken yet, but stay tuned. And so I knew I had a facility with languages, but the facility with languages has deteriorated a great deal. I've begun to learn Hebrew. I did do an adult bar mitzvah at a conservative shul so I could learn to learn Torah and read Torah so that I could really navigate my way through the Siddur. I've taken 2 additional semesters of biblical Hebrew. Now I'm studying modern conversational Hebrew. I've studied a bunch of other stuff, and I'm doing all of this while I have a day job as well and am a parent. The final and most unbelievable thing about all this is that I struggle not with whether and why I'm Jewish, but I struggle with trying to bring that profound silence into a daily Jewish experience. I know that the sages meditated. They meditated for an hour before praying and an hour after, 3 times a day. 9 hours a day spent in prayer or meditation. There's a good deal of scholarship indicating that meditation was a critical part of the Jewish tradition. There's nothing un-Jewish about meditation done properly. And I think in Western society, part of what beckons us toward meditation is that we understand on a visceral level that something is missing and that noise is covering over the empty space. So for me, I've begun to cultivate a discipline of meditation that is inherently Jewish, that involves objectless meditation like what we just did, but also involves musar, and also involves certain kinds of Kabbalistic meditation that I feel comfortable with, even though I think Kabbalah has to be approached very, very carefully, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that more and more it is not approached all that carefully, so I try to be very careful with it. And none of this really would have happened without the context being set during my conversation and my correspondence with Rabbi Tatz. He said at one point that this world is referred to as a world of doubt and a world of falsehood. Alma Desveka and Alma Deshikra, is that right? So, and Alma shares the same root as the word olam. In other words, the world is hiding something. The world is covering over something, and we are getting better and better at creating the things that obscure the essential truth. Whereas, if you're not Jewish, observantly, and the word that you think of for all that is universe, then the essential paradigm that you bought into is universum. In other words, from the many, one. Whereas the Jewish view is exactly the other way around. There is the one that is hiding the complexity of the many. All these things can be approached they can be approached logically, but when you approach them logically, you have to look at 2 sides of a dichotomy. When you approach them extra-logically, the way that Zen Buddhists approach everything, you move beyond logic, you move beyond words, you move beyond intellect. These things have served us terribly well, and they're also the reason why Jews feel in the West that the intellect is supreme and that faith traditions like ours are Narishkeit. That's really it. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Really rather leave most of the time to David and to answering questions. Let me just pick out one theme maybe to try to demonstrate a Jewish angle or response to one of the ideas that we have discussed. Really, there's too much to talk about and cover all the areas, hundreds of pages in this book in which we try to think through many of the relevant issues. But let me pick out one theme maybe just to try to show how differently we look or how we resolve a particular problem that is raised in Buddhist thinking. One of the things that I learned from David was the idea in Buddhist sources that longing is a problem. Longing, when you long, as you heard him explain, then by definition you're unhappy. Longing for something means that you're not at that place. So that if you're on a journey and you don't regard every moment as destination, by definition you're unhappy. And the Buddhists, as I understand, explain that that's one of the prime causes of suffering in the world. If you're not longing, if you're satisfied with where you are, then you overcome suffering. If you long for something and you yearn for something beyond where you are, then by definition you have a lack. You lack the thing you yearn for, and so you suffer. And therefore the goal is to overcome yearning and overcome longing. What's the Jewish idea about that? How do we resolve that issue? It's a real cry, it's a real tension, it's a real issue. You know that in Judaism there's a mitzvah to long. There's a mitzvah, in fact, the Talmud says that one of the few questions you're asked after dying is tzipisa lishua, did you long for redemption? That means you have to go through your whole life, and all we have to go through history, longing for a better world. And the question, of course, is, doesn't that generate unhappiness? Right? And the answer is amazing, and it's paradoxical. The answer is that you have to be longing for a better world, and you have to be perfectly happy where you are at the same time. It's paradoxical. First of all, you see, if you don't long for a better world, then the price you pay for happiness and for serenity and fulfillment where you are is a limited situation. Let me give you an analogy for this. There's a beautiful analogy that is brought in another context in one of the classic early sources, Rabbi Yonah, many centuries ago. He describes the following scenario. He says, imagine a number of people trapped in a jail. They're imprisoned in a jail. And as they sit in the jail cell, they decide to build a tunnel, to dig a tunnel to escape. And after much work, they build a tunnel, and they slip out through the tunnel and they escape. And one of them remains behind. One of them remains behind in the jail. There's a tunnel, he could easily escape, he sits there. Sometime later, the jailer enters the cell, and he sees the fellow who's remained behind, and he starts beating him mercilessly. So the fellow says to the jailer, why are you beating me? I'm the only one who's obeying the law. Right? I'm the one who's still here. Why are you beating me? End of story. What Rabbi Yonah is telling us is an amazing thing. He's telling us this, that the people who escaped the jail have escaped. But the person who remains has destroyed the jail. The reason is that a jail, by definition, is a thing that holds people who don't want to be there. You're only imprisoned if you long to be someplace else. But when the jail has a means of escape, and one person reveals that he's not trying to escape, he reveals that to him this wasn't a jail in the first place. The jail is beating him because this person has utterly destroyed the concept of a jail. The other people have defined it as a jail and they've escaped. But this person's crime is much deeper. He has invalidated the idea of a jail. And he's being beaten because he's defeated the jail in a much deeper way than the people who have escaped. And what Rabbi Yonah is telling us is that when you don't long to escape the jail, when you demonstrate that you are utterly serene and happy where you are, you've defined imprisonment as freedom. You've defined freedom as imprisonment. Right? And that, of course, is ultimate tragedy. And therefore, it's essential that we long for perfection. You have to long for your own perfection. You have to long for the world's perfection. You have to long for a world that doesn't have objective suffering in it. And the problem is, doesn't that cause your own suffering? And the answer is, you know, if you go to any Orthodox environment, you go to any Orthodox home, any Torah home, you notice that we display on the walls photographs of the faces of the sages of the Jewish people. Old black and white photographs people put on the walls. From the beginning of the days of photography, 150 years, 180 years, whenever it was, we put up the pictures on the walls. And the novice, when he sees those photographs, he thinks that we put the pictures on the walls. In the non-Jewish world, they put their pictures on the walls. The kids put their sports stars in, drug addicts in. Put them on the walls. They look up to them in idolization. So we put rabbis on the walls. It's a deep error. The reason we put those faces on the wall to look at is not a question of idolization. It's a question of education. Because in each of those faces, the face of a person who has reached a level of sensitivity, reached a level of effort in Torah, and reach some level of perfection of character, you can see on the face a remarkable thing. And one of the remarkable things that you see on those faces, you see faces that are deeply etched with awareness of the world's reality. On those shoulders, you feel the weight of suffering of the Jewish people in the world. And yet, if you look carefully at those faces, you will see not a line of frustration. That means on those faces, you see at the same time, you see genuine awareness of the reality of the world, and not a line of complaint or frustration. You know, if you've ever had the privilege of being associated with people of Torah greatness, I had the privilege of being close to Rav Simcha Wasserman, one of the great teachers of the last generation. You see it palpably in them. You see an unbelievable joy and serenity that is somehow no contradiction to the awareness of the world's suffering. You know, once my brother-in-law, who was Rav Wasserman's physician, he has a very close relationship with him over many years. He once gathered the courage to ask the Rav a personal question. Rav Wasserman must have been 85 at the time, or close to 90. And since he was a person who'd been through the most unspeakable tragedy 65 years ago, and before that, his whole family and his wife's family, a long life of tragedy. And he had a scintillating joy. He had those amazing, sparkling blue eyes that emanated joy. So once, as his doctor, he gathered the courage and he said to him, how does the Rav manage such joy always? How do you live a life that is so fraught with memories of suffering? And every situation you're in, there's such a tangible joy. Rav Wasserman looked at him with those amazing, penetrating blue eyes, and he said the following thing. Listen well to this. He said, every situation I find myself in, I ask what can be done. And whatever can be done, I do. And what cannot be done, I do not worry about. You know what most of us do? We don't do what should be done, and we worry. But the formula for serenity in life is to do what you have to do. What you can't do is not your problem. It's somebody else in charge. That doesn't mean you're unaware of the suffering. A person of spiritual greatness can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and he can know exactly where he is, and he can have complete and utter serenity, because he knows he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. And therefore, you can be living in a situation of tremendous yearning for perfection and clear acknowledgement of the imperfection of where you are. But if you're spiritually evolved, you can have the serenity of knowing that you are completely fulfilled at that moment. That means that this is a perfect destination at this moment. You look at the photographs. There's a photograph of the face of the Panovich Arov, a close-up photograph taken of his face just after they killed his wife and 10 children. There's not a flicker, there's not a hint of a subtlety, of a suggestion of complaint. Or I had the privilege once of sitting with Rav Wasserman at the Pesach Seder. Again, he was in his late 80s. When he was 90, we couldn't keep up with him. We couldn't keep up with him physically, let alone in learning. The only person I ever saw kept up with him was the Rebbitzin. She was 88. And during the Seder, Rav Wasserman insisted on drinking a full cup of wine, the 4 cups. And after the second full cup of wine, for a rare moment, we were able to ask him personal questions about his past. Never spoke about that. And we got him talking about some of the... When he was 15 and there was a Russian pogrom, they left him for dead in the street. A young non-Jewish girl came past and picked him up and put him to the hospital. The Russians came into the hospital and killed everyone in their beds. The only reason he survived because they put him in the infectious disease ward, and they were too afraid to go into the infectious disease. I mean, one story like this after another. And during the telling of one of these stories, his wife let out a sigh. A sigh. The rabbits, a sigh. And I'll never forget this. He turned to her and he said to her in Yiddish, Fegele, are you complaining? And she said, no. End of discussion. So that's our take on longing. The world is imperfect. The Buddhists are right about that. There's a deep unsatisfactoriness and a deep suffering in the world. And there's something wrong with you and something terribly insensitive if you don't feel that. Of course you should feel that. You should feel it for every living creature. According to Torah thinking, you should feel it for animals too, let alone Jews and non-Jews, humans. But at the same time, you have to develop a serenity, and the two seem paradoxical, but a person who's spiritually sensitive can do that. What's a personal application? You know, you're sitting this evening in a place that dedicates itself to Jewish outreach. Jewish outreach, we try to help share the Jewish tradition with Jews who have no background. If you define this as your role in life, as I, for example, have chosen to do, your life's a tragedy. Because we're not winning the war. More than 50% of American Jews today claim no point of contact with anything Jewish at all. Not religious, anything Jewish at all. Which means they would intermarry and bring that sequence of events that is the result of thousands of years of Jewish history to a complete end, not because they don't want to marry Jews, because they don't even know that it's relevant. So you work in Jewish outreach today, it's definitely a losing battle. In the last 30 years in the United States, they've figured that about 30,000 people, Jews, have been seriously impacted by Jewish education and changed their lives. And in the same period, 700,000 have disappeared. So you dedicate your life to a program like this, and you're a failure. So how do you survive? Because you have to understand that when you're fighting a war, and the war's being lost, but you fulfilling your function, while being aware that the war's being lost, you can have your sense of serenity. If you're a soldier, and you think your job is to win the war, and the war's being lost, you're a loss. But if you're a medic on the battlefield, and your job is to pull in one more wounded soldier after another and stop his bleeding, the fact that the war's been lost, of course you feel, but that's not my problem. There's someone who runs this army and this war. He knows what he's doing. I can rely on him. The question is, are you doing what you have to do? That's the challenge. Okay, that's just one take on one of the issues that came up in discussion between us on Buddhist Jewish themes. And what I'm going to do now is invite questions, right? All your questions will be directed at David. He's the one who knows the answers. And you're welcome to ask anything. David says he doesn't mind being asked personal questions about his own path and his own details about his own past and his present, and we're very happy to try to answer if we can. Please feel free to ask. We'll repeat the question so everyone can hear, and if you don't feel comfortable asking a question, you can send it up in writing with pleasure. We'll read it out.
The question was, the gentleman asked whether and how I was able to resolve the issues with my wife. I moved straight from, the story of her saying that my practicing Buddhism was like a knife in her heart. I moved straight from that to the story of my ordination, which is just like a man, And so, yes, I can answer the question. We had a pretty serious argument with our son, who was then about, I don't know, maybe 5, sitting there on the bed watching this transpire. But at this point, I had already begun to sort of back away from Buddhist practice. And really, the way it resolved, I mean, when I read that section that I read to you, a lot of people say, so you guys are divorced, right? I mean, they assumed from that we were going down in flames. But what happened was that because I returned to Jewish study, and because I just felt that I was being unfaithful to many aspects of my life at once, including our marriage, and because I felt deeply called to go back to Judaism, the argument that we had, this all sort of evaporated right in front of me. The whole thing became clear, and the long and short of it is, I said, I'm done. I'm done with Buddhism. I'm done with putting a knife in your heart. I feel deeply called to go back to Jewish practice. Can we just let me do that and see how that goes? And she said, absolutely, I'd be delighted. And I began corresponding with Rabbi Tatz and also studying with the Orthodox rabbis through whom I met Rabbi Tatz. So the fact that I really sort of abruptly changed direction spiritually did wonders for the marriage. So the question was, do I still practice meditation? Do I do it in a Jewish context? And how do I integrate that with Jewish prayer and with my day job? Did I get that right? So the answer is, I try every morning, I don't succeed, but I try, to do objectless meditation. I also study Musar. And the meditation is done side by side, not at the same time, but side by side with the affirmation of whatever midah I'm working on. And this helps concentrate the mind wonderfully toward prayer, generally. So really, the work in Musar, along with the objectless meditation, is part of the larger picture of my Jewish practice. And the prayer that I do is done in Kehillah the way other Jews do it. Rabbi Tatz asked if I put on tefillin, and when I go to Minyan and when I'm in Shul other than Shabbat, yes, I do put on tefillin. The question was about, we've been given the Shemona Esrei as a kind of meditative tool, but many of us feel it's sort of locked away in a box and we can't access the meditative aspects of that. And my understanding, I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong, although I'm sure you'll do it tactfully, carefully, is that really the Amidah really replaced the Merkava meditation that Ezekiel is so famous for, that it became, as Jewish life became more difficult and more dispersed, it became too difficult to learn, too dangerous to practice under any then other the exactly right circumstance. In other words, it is designed to be meditative. I think the larger question is, are there reputable sources and texts about Jewish meditation? I have relied heavily on Aryeh Kaplan, and specifically on his books Jewish Meditation and Meditation in the Bible. The Jewish meditation gives very concrete Torah-based examples of what Jewish meditation is and how it can work, how you can learn and practice it. Meditation in the Bible roots that in a Torah context and says this is where meditation happened in the Bible. As with most things Jewish, it really helps to know Hebrew, so that when you see a word or a phrase or understand a certain pattern that occurs in Torah, you can understand not just the literal level of what's going on, but the deeper levels as well.
The question is, what are the limits of the idolatrous aspect of other religions, particularly Buddhism, the statues, the bowing, etc.? It seems that the Buddhism that is practiced in America as Zen Buddhism probably is not idolatrous as such. David will tell you stories about people who question the priests in the Buddhist temple about idolatry, and they'll break the statue in front of you to show you that they're not really worshipping it, right? There's a famous Buddhist statement that says that if you meet the Buddha himself, you should kill him, right? Of course, we would never speak that way, in Judaism, but the idea is, at least one of the ideas is that they're not really worshipping anything. The Buddha was a human being. They don't claim that he was more than that, not in Zen Buddhism. There is a Jewish problem with bowing. In fact, I've met many Jewish Buddhists who the first thing they ask is, are we allowed to bow? In fact, I've met many Jewish Buddhists who do Buddhism fully, but they don't bow. And in fact, that's correct. The law about bowing in Judaism is that you're not allowed to bow to anything with certain exceptions. You can bow to a king. You can also bow to a human if it's not a question of worship, right? For example, if you have a spiritual teacher, there's nothing wrong bowing to that person. If you're a martial arts expert, right, you're a karate or a judo expert, there's nothing wrong with the practice of bowing down to an opponent before you kill him. It's absolutely fine. So we don't have a problem with bowing to a human being, provided that there's no element of worship in the human being. What's not allowed in Judaism is bowing to any object. For example, there are martial arts systems where they bow to the sword. Japanese sword fighting, for example, they don't only bow to the teacher and to the dojo, which is the gymnasium, and to the opponent, they also bow to the sword. That's definitely not allowed in Judaism. And a fascinating question is, can you bow to nothing? In Zen Buddhism, they have a practice of bowing to nothing, right? That means that they are, and when you ask them about it, they'll tell you the reason they're bowing is they're simply submitting and subduing, they're conquering ego, they're teaching themselves that they are nothing, they're not bowing to anything outside of themselves. That's also forbidden in Jewish thinking. The reason is that unless you're bowing to Hashem through the direction of Yerushalayim, like we do when we say Modim Anachnu Lach, or when you are bowing to a human in a way that is permitted, the problem is that bowing to nothing probably has only two interpretations. Either you're really bowing to the self in a way which is extremely problematic, or to nothingness, which is also problematic. There's a fascinating interpretation. In Aleinu we say that we are not like other nations, right, and the families of the earth, who bow to nothingness, right? Hashem mishtachavim lehevel varik. Those people who bow to nothingness. The conventional translation of that is who bow to gods and human figures that they worship, who in fact are nothing, right? In fact, there were many Jewish communities over many ages that expunged that line and censored it because they were anxious that it would cause a lot of violent anti-Semitism to insult other people's religions. But there are Jewish commentaries that say that there's another translation of that. It doesn't only mean that we don't bow to false gods, which in fact are empty, but we also don't bow to nothingness. In other words, the very act of bowing to nothing is problematic halachically. And therefore, you're not allowed to bow to those things, and if you wanted to do Buddhist meditation, you certainly would not be allowed to. You could bow to your teacher in acknowledgement, but you could not bow to the cushion, as they do. They bow to the cushion before they sit on it, and they bow to the hall, and they bow to the image of the Buddha. That would certainly not be allowed to do. You asked another question, which is about going into other places of worship. That depends very clearly on whether the place of worship is idolatrous or not, right? The Jewish ruling is that Christianity has an element of idolatry. It's called shituf, taking a human and giving him divine status. That's problematic. For that reason, you should not enter a Christian church. You should not, there's no real prohibition on entering a mosque. I mean, there may be practical reasons, you know, that one may not want to do that, but there's no real religious reason, because the Buddhists, the Muslims, are clearly worshipping the God of Abraham, very clearly, explicitly, and there's no question about that. Religions that are idolatrous would be problematic. A Zen meditation hall probably doesn't come into the element. Tibetan Buddhism is a completely different story, and I'm not sure if David was a Tibetan Buddhist, if we'd been able even to engage in a real even-handed discussion. But since he was following the Zen tradition, which is, as he said, very spare and sparse, and it's simply getting to know yourself and your essence, that really doesn't, on the face of it, doesn't really provide a halachic problem.
I think the first question was, have I been able to resolve or in some way recapture the sort of inner peace that I experienced in Buddhist meditation? I mean, I think the best answer I can give is that I am more at peace now with being Jewish than I was at peace in being in a Zen center. In other words, I'm more comfortable in my skin now as a Jew than I ever was as somebody in a Zen center who knew on some level that it was not compatible with who I was always going to be. Perhaps another way to say it is that I am more comfortable with the eternal discomfort of being Jewish than I ever was. And it goes back to what Rabbi Tatz said. I mean, I think the longing, the striving, the desiring to effect tikkun olam is something that feels native to me, and that there is peace within that. But it is not the peace of the blissful and separated and individualistic kind. It is a universal kind within the universe of the Jewish community, truly. Others have pointed out to me before that I probably went back to Judaism because I simply had my tail between my legs and my wife would have shot me. To which I would respond that many marriages have ended over this issue in which spouses have not gone back. To me, it's a matter of pure humility. Like I said, admitting that something that you're doing, if it works for you and not for the wider relationships in your life, then you are making an individual choice at the expense of a communal choice, which is really neither an individual or a communal choice. So while my wife would have shot me, if Buddhism were really deeply seated within me, I wouldn't have cared. I wouldn't have cared if she'd shot me in the back of the head as I walked away. Now, to your other question, is there an element of faith or truth? So by these, I can deduce several meanings and see the subtitles flashing above your head. But suffice it to say that faith and truth have a distinct role in any spiritual tradition. I think Judaism is different for Jews in that I believe that faith and truth are things that can be discovered at the molecular and the atomic and the DNA level if they're looked for in the right way and under the right guidance. I happen to be fortunate to have good teachers and to come into contact with Rabbi Tatz at a time when the feeling I was having could be made sense of. So the ultimate answer to your question is, and I think Rabbi Tatz says this in our book, meditation in and of itself is, if it doesn't involve bowing, is perfectly fine. In fact, I think more than fine. It's urgently important for Jews to do. If it's part of another tradition, and my Zen teach, the way Zen is packaged in the West, we're told it can fit inside any other tradition. I had a Carmelite nun meditating next to me. There were black evangelicals. There were people of all stripes because we're told it can fit into any other tradition. The fact is, when you get deeper into the tradition, you see that it is profoundly incompatible with Jewish practice. What rests at the core of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, objectless meditation, can be an aid, not an impediment to faith and truth. When you begin going down the slope into deeper practice of the tradition, I think as a Jew, as somebody who's been Jewish throughout time, throughout your DNA, then you have a problem.
The question is really, if you explore modern Orthodox or even Orthodox Judaism today, you often find a lack of genuine spirituality, connection with deep meditative elements and so forth. Is that right, and how do we deal with that? I think there's no question you're right. There's no question that we've lost a deep connection to fundamentals, right? We're experiencing in many ways a Jewish and spiritual Holocaust, no question about that. That's why we have places like this that are dedicated to try to help Jews who are interested explore a genuine depth, no question about that. And we've tried to begin programs that attack this at many levels, even working with very young people to try to show them the fascination and the endless depth that traditionally they were not attached to. But this has been an ongoing problem for the last couple of hundred years. Many would say that the Hasidic movement was a response to a certain perceived lack, right? The Hasidic movement, among many other things, brought a rhapsodic element, an experiential element, an element of music, dance, of sensation of elevation, among many other things. It's not as simple as that. And many would say there was a response to a certain emptiness that was felt in certain quarters at the time. One of the problems we experience here with that is that one of the most moving and ecstatic experiences you can have in Judaism is learning, right? Is learning itself. The problem is for people who are brought up without the tools, it takes an awfully long time to get to a level of expertise where you can actually feel that you're not a spectator but actually doing it. It's very, very difficult. But there's no solution to that other than actually being given the tools. You have to experiment with Aleph Base and learn that. It is in the tools, right? One of the major tragic errors of American Judaism, American Reform Judaism, was to decide that in order to get out to the people, let's translate it into the language that they can understand. When you do that, it's not Torah anymore. Yes, you make it accessible, but it's not Torah. It's like saying, the patient can't digest real food, let's give him sort of paper, pulp, and plastic, because he likes it. Yes, he likes it, and he's going to eat it, but he's... Say again. Give me a moment just to finish this. So the problem is that that when they translated it into other languages, they took away the essence of the thing itself. There's no way back, but other than becoming not a spectator but a genuine player. There's only the only way back is by hard work. I'm sorry. It's largely not being taught in the Orthodox world in that particular form. David quoted you some sources you can read on the subject, and we have a different version of it that is practiced, which is very hard to put into words. We call it das. Das means an awareness that is beyond logic and words, which underlies all knowledge. And if you read the classic Mussar texts, and if you've ever experienced a Mussar session where you're brought in touch with this in a very deep and powerful way, you'll notice that people do it by chanting. If you go into a conventional yeshiva, an Orthodox yeshiva, conventional yeshiva, you'll find that half an hour a day is carved out for this exercise. And it can be a very deep and meditative experience, very often done taking a Mussar principle and chanting it again and again and again, sometimes week after week to drive it into the character. Sometimes people feel a little awkward and emotionally vulnerable about doing that kind of thing, but it is practiced. But the conventional form of meditation of 35 minutes and so forth has not become an accepted thing in modern Orthodoxy. You're welcome to introduce it. I have no objection. As you heard, it was traditional to meditate for an hour before every Shemona Esrei. The Talmud says they spend 9 hours a day doing that, an hour to meditate, to get into the head. The Nefesh HaChaim says you have to climb out of your body to do that. He explains it very clearly. And they spent an hour coming down, which doesn't really mean coming down. It means bringing that experience into the mundane.
The gentleman wants me to say something more about the experience that I had, which really was my definitive encounter with my Jewish neshama, with a divine presence. I wouldn't be so bold as to suggest I'm in touch with God, but it was a profound and unmoving experience. He wants me to say more about it. I'm not sure what more I can say, but I will say this. So when you're trying to meditate, in Zen Buddhism, you don't close your eyes because too many images can occur that dance through the mind's eye that are kind of imaginative in character, and you can be, taken through flights of fancy that seem like meditation but really aren't. You can also fall asleep, which is a huge danger when you're sitting still on a pillow for 35 minutes at a time. I mean, you see people fall asleep all the time, and in very traditional Zen centers and in Japan, in monasteries to this day, the priest will walk around during times of meditation when they're meditating all day long with a stick. And if you fall asleep or if your posture is just not just right, you get smacked. So you have to work very hard at this.
Would you like us to start there?
I think he left. For that I must bow to him. So to try to quickly to answer your question, here was the experience. My eyes are focused 45 degrees down, roughly where the wall and the floor join, and there is a descent of the color blue over everything that I'm seeing. And I feel tears well up in my eyes, and there's a vague kind of visual sensory thing happening, but I'm not sure what it is. And I try moving my head a little bit to see if something's in my eye, and it doesn't go away. And this thing that feels as though it is lowered down over me just stays there. And the minute my meditation is over, it's gone, but I feel irrevocably changed. And each time I went back to the meditation center, I had this feeling again. I sat in meditation, I was fine, and at some point during the 35 minutes, this would happen to me again. And it felt like a combination of homecoming, and if I may use the word, absolution, and a profound kind of meeting that was not something that I could define rationally, intellectually, or do any better than that. Sorry to say. The gentleman asks, why didn't I connect that to Buddhism? It's a very good question. I gave a talk on Yom Kippur at a shul near my house in the Chicago area, and every time I give a talk in a shul about my experience, this happens every time. Two parents drag a abashed-looking young person toward me who clearly is in the clutches of a sort of parental lockdown, and they say, "Here's our son, he's a Buddhist, do something, quick. He's flying home tomorrow, quick, do something." And one such gentleman was pushed toward me, and he said, and this blew my mind, this was amazing to me, he said, yeah, I'm getting a PhD in Tibetan Buddhism. He said, you know what that was? That experience you had, that was just your Buddha nature telling you to go back to Judaism. Think about that. Think about that. That was your Buddha nature telling you to go back to Judaism. In other words, what is at the bottom of all of us, regardless of who you are, what faith you're born into, how many eons you go back, it's your Buddha nature that's moving you into the faith tradition, into the path. That's certainly one way to look at it. But the wordless condition that I met did not feel Buddhist. It felt like an encounter with a deep Jewish identity and the source of that identity. It's just what it announced itself to me as. I know it sounds hokey, but I tried to explain it away and I couldn't.
Was it always blue?
Was it always blue?
Is that significant?
I don't know. I don't know if it's significant. All I know is that's how it was. I don't know if it was significant that it was blue. It wore a lovely chiffon thing for Purim. I'm sorry to be frivolous. I'm sorry. No, it was. I don't know why. I have no idea what significance that has. Yes, in the back. It's a very good question. The question is, despite that I'd sort of swapped one set of beliefs for another, had I always had a belief in God? Generally, the short answer to your question is yes. The longer answer is that sometimes I feel as though belief is just a hole waiting to be filled with knowledge, that we talk a lot about what we believe, we set our positions in concrete, and then we commence to arguing about them. But really, belief and knowledge come together for us on the strong feeling of whether there is or isn't a God. Some people feel that there is, and I live and work, and I have people in my family who strongly feel that there is not. I always felt that, yes, there is a God. Always did. Yes. The question is, with all the Jews falling away from any kind of affiliation and going to other traditions, where do I think we're failing? Now remember, I'm just some guy off the street. I feel incredibly privileged to share my experience with you, but I feel compelled to say that my experience is only my experience. This place is full of experts of various kinds who I think might be better suited to answer this question. The only reason I might be able to answer the question is I travel some now and talk about this experience and hear from people. And I've seen here tonight a reinforcement of the idea that people are hungry and thirsty for a kind of spiritual experience that does not involve talk, that does not involve chatter, that does not only engage at the intellectual or the dogmatic level. But in America, we're also failing because there is an inherent distrust, and there has always been an inherent distrust of any kind of authority and any kind of dogma, any kind of tradition in many communities, not all, it's an oversimplification, but in many communities, a reflexive distrust of authority that says anybody who's trying to teach you something that will get you to behave in a certain way is inherently suspect. Combination of those two things, a lack of silence and a distrust of authority, means that most Jews who are comfortable in their society and assimilated to a degree never before imagined, mean that they'd be shooting themselves in the foot as far as they're concerned, to go back to a kind of practice that involves what they consider to be superstition and which takes up a lot of time when they could be watching the football game. Why? I think the woman's very well put question, which I'm going to butcher, isn't there a problem with objectless meditation, which is kind of a self-contained and in many ways self-referential experience? Doesn't that pose a kind of obstacle to meditation as a Jewish experience, Rabbi?
Actually, paradoxically, we do agree with that approach. The concept of das, which is something we could not possibly begin to discuss this evening, is an inner knowledge that is a substrate. It is a foundation of knowledge that comes long before any fact that is known. And all of Jewish understanding and intellectualism is based on an assumption that that is very strong within you. If you'd like to experience this, the basis of it is knowledge of your own existence. Knowledge of your own existence is an objectless, undetailed, uncluttered, raw awareness. And it's not something that can be logically discussed. It can't be expressed at all. One of the classic problems in secular philosophy, Western philosophy, is that there's no objective demonstration of your own existence. Right? And yet it is something that is a kind of knowledge that is more real than anything that can be put into words. The paradox is when you can only communicate, you can only talk about it in words. So as soon as you try to express it, it begins to break down. But the Jewish approach to all wisdom and all knowledge is an assumption that before you begin any details, you have a very strong grasp. And the words intuitive and experiential, these are all vague and inaccurate, right? But there is you can demonstrate it in many peripheral ways. You know, they say that the philosophy professor was once telling the students that there's no formal proof that you exist. One of the students got very distressed, and a week later he came back to the professor, you know, very upset, and he said, "Professor, you have to tell me, do I exist?" So the professor said, "Who wishes to know?" No? Now, there are exercises you can do that take you through this, but there's no question that our attitude, and like many questioners have been asking this evening, why aren't we taught this? This has to be taught in a very, very deep and subtle way. You absorb it from being associated with people who obviously have their own inner sense. The problem is trying to put these things into words very seriously trivializes them, right? And therefore it has to be a very subtle. We live in a world today where there's so much empty talk, there's so much superficialization, there's so much that's damaged in this area, right, that it's almost impossible even to begin to talk about this in a way that is subtle. You'll notice that all Kabbalistic description, for example, is all metaphorical. The concept is, for example, most of the Kabbalistic works talk about the body. They don't mean the body at all, but they're giving you the credit for being able to translate that into a wordless zone, right? It is the beginning of all knowledge. Part of the problem is that we've lost the skills, and a deep part of the problem is that we live in a Western philosophical tradition that is entirely material and empirical, right? In fact, we're coming up to Hanukkah now. The deepest axiom of Hanukkah is that our battle was with the Greeks, and the Greeks are entirely a tradition of empirical, measurable knowledge you can put in the lab. The whole concept, the whole depth, the whole difference that exists between us is that we claim a dimension of knowledge that goes beyond or starts before the intellectual. How do you teach people about that? How do you talk about that? Right? The irony of this area is you can only share it with somebody who has it already. The more you have to speak about it to explain it, the less chance you have of getting it across. Right? In fact, one of the deepest problems in Torah teaching is how do you open a student to this deep awareness when any words you're going to say about it are going to damage it? Right? We can't really go into the broader aspects of this evening, but it's a very deep issue. But let me assure you, there's no question that objectless meditation, right, knowing that you are, without any intellectualization, has to begin long before. In fact, I'll leave you with just one thought, which is a very deep secret. Our sources that talk about it say that the beginning of faith is this knowledge. The way you discover Hashem is by knowing, first of all, that you are beyond questions and intellectualization. And as you meditate on that deeply, you begin to become aware that you are, but you're not all that there is. You are within a context. There's something beyond you of which you are a part, paradoxically part of, and paradoxically identified as an individual. And you can only get in touch with that through knowledge of yourself. If you want an analogy, you can only love yourself. You can never love anyone else. You can only love yourself. The way you love someone else successfully is you expand your sense of self until it includes them. When your sense of self has expanded to someone you love in a marriage, to someone, your family, to the Jewish people, to humanity, if you can extend it that far, this problem of love disappears. As soon as you mesh into someone else, where your sense of self becomes defined so broadly that you and they have become one, there's no question of love. There's no effort that's needed to do that. The Hebrew word for ahava, love, adds up to 13. Exactly the same numerical equivalent as the word echad, which means one. And the root of ahava means to give, means giving. When you give yourself intensely into someone else, then you and they become one. The problem of love disappears. But that can only be done where you have a deep and abiding knowledge of self and love of self. Not in the selfish way, but in the real way. Johnny, I think we've heard about all the questions I can answer, that's for sure. So maybe you want to wrap it up.